how do we draw lines between things that we might say are maybe wrong and immoral that we don't like, but we understand are maybe not the role of government to proactively enforce?
So there's two things here. One is the fundamental distinction that has to be made between a sin and a crime. Okay? All law should have a moral foundation, but not everything with a moral foundation should be a law, right? I don't want covetousness police. That's the 10th of...
Yeah.
I don't want some sheriff pulling a J. Crew catalog out of some woman's hand saying, you were looking, you were coveting there. That's not within the capacity of the civil magistrate to deal with sin. I don't want lust police. I don't want covetousness police. I don't want people. I don't want the magistrate trying to examine our hearts and motives. Okay, that's one level. We have to maintain the distinction between a sin and a crime. Your illustration on opening an investigation for miscarriages is another one where, let's say a woman deliberately did some things to cause herself to miscarry. That would be a crime. That would be a crime in the sight of God, but we are not competent to gather up the witnesses. We ought not to charge people with capital crimes without 2 and 3 witnesses. There's some things that people are just going to get away with, which is why we as Christians have to wait for the last day. And we would make a bigger mess by trying to investigate every miscarriage.
Sure.
Right. We'd make a much, much bigger mess than not. So those sorts of things could be considered criminal and unjust taking of human life in principle, but it's beyond our competency to investigate. Okay.
So that makes sense. So it's, I guess what I'm, and I think it makes sense from the side of, again, recognizing the practical limitations without excusing the act.
Correct.
And this is where I go. So for me, I've always kind of operated on this idea that there's different provinces. So like there's the province of the individual, the province of the family, the province of the church, the province of the state, and they have different rules and responsibilities and different authorities within their respected spheres.
Correct.
Obviously, with respect to the state, there's now almost no sphere that the state doesn't intervene or interfere on to some degree. I think one of the biggest concerns that people have when they hear Christian nationalism is this is going to be clerics debating issues of whether or not you violated a tenet of Christianity. So for instance, thou shalt not have any other gods before me. Okay, so you live in this society, but you don't go to church, or, how is that illegal now? Or do we have some sort of, and if it's illegal, then there has to be some form of punishment, right? And so I think you've answered part of it with the distinction between something that is sinful versus something that can be a crime with an illegal statute.
Right. Not going to church is a sin.
Yeah.
And ought not to be a crime.
Yeah.
Right.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it.
I don't want the government regulating that. But this is the kick in the teeth. All right. One of the reasons the people who are objecting to Christian nationalists because we're saying and doing scary things like let's not stop making Jesus mad.
Yeah.
Why do you think? Well, okay, that's a separate thing.
Yeah.
But these same people want to import millions of Muslims who have no concept of this distinction between a sin and a crime.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So if you want clerics who are dictating behavior, if you want a bunch of weird beards telling you what you can and cannot do, then your immigration policies are on the fast track to that. What they're afraid of with Christian nationalism is an ecclesiocracy, right, with clerics running the show.
Yeah.
But one of the tenets of Christian nationalism is the separation of church and state.
Right. Which blows their mind. Yeah.
It's going to blow their mind.
Yeah.
The separation of church and state is another distinction, another doctrine that flowed out of a Christian consensus. So, for example, and this is a mind blower, when there's a great book called Disestablishment and Religious Dissent, which is an examination of church-state setups in all the states at the time of the adoption of between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And here's the trippy thing. Multiple states required that you, in order to hold public office, and in at least one case, in order to vote, you had to be a Protestant Christian. Okay, that was just commonplace.
I think like Maryland and Virginia were exceptions.
And then in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, and New Hampshire, they had an established state church, the Congregational Church, down into the early part of the 1800s. And then Vermont, which was the 14th state to join the Union after the Constitution, had an established state church when they came into the Union. Now, I think state churches at the state level, established churches at the state level is not a good idea either. I want separation of church and state at the state level also. My only point in bringing that up is that even if it's a bad idea, it's not an unconstitutional idea.
Yes, that's
right?
correct.
And the thing, but here's the trippy part. A number of these colonies required you to be a Protestant Christian, not just a Christian, but a Protestant Christian in order to be able to hold office. And they also simultaneously prohibited ministers from holding public office. Okay,
I didn't know that.
Okay, that you may not be you may not be a state legislator if you are a clergyman. You may not. You have to be a Christian. But you may not be an officer of
What was the reasoning behind that? Was it to prevent the kind of
separation of church and state, which is okay. Right now, and this is a good example of a Christian consensus, a Christian ethos that was pervasive throughout the states, and they had a distinction where you are responsible to God, you're responsible to the government of the church, which is a distinct government from civil government. Now, we want all our civil legislators to be Christians, but we don't want any ministers because it's going to muddy up the waters. Okay. So because they had a very clear idea of the separation of church and state, which is different than the separation of morality and state. Okay. So we know the drill, right? If let's say there's somebody running for Senate, running for re-election, and somebody finds out that he grew up in a fundamentalist church and that he still goes there. And so the reporter asks him at the press conference, "Senator, it's not worthy. You belong to this church. What impact will that have on your behavior in Washington if you were to be reelected?" And everybody knows that that's a catechism question, because the response, you can write it, "My faith, which is a very precious and private thing."
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't like the Federal Reserve. And I really don't like fiat currency because, quite frankly, I am tired of living in an inflation to inflation style of economy. And that is why I am getting a lot more interested in precious metals. It's also why I reached out to Lear Capital, because I appreciate the fact that they're not just trying to sell me something without actually educating me about it. In fact, Lear Capital will send you a free investor kit that includes a $4,500 gold report where you can actually learn about how you can actually own physical gold. That's right. When your government decides to debank you, the question is what do you have on hand that actually has genuine intrinsic value that has stood the test of time? Lear will set you up to actually own gold, silver, precious metals on your physical location, right there, your safety deposit box, your safe, you got it. Plus, they will also educate you on how you can actually roll it over into your 401k, into your IRA, all of that good stuff. Plus, my viewers get a special offer of up to $15,000 in bonus gold or silver with qualified purchase. Now, if you want to learn more about this, I'm going to encourage you to get started today by calling Lear at 800-707-4575. That's 800-707-4575, or visit nick4lear.com. That's Nick, the number 4lear.com. We thank him for advertising for us. Go over there, get educated, be able to protect your investments. When I first ran for office, like the quote I put on my website was, I said, "I am first and foremost a Christian. My entire worldview flows from this." The statement I made was, my belief in individual liberty, personal responsibility, property rights, free markets is rooted in this understanding. And I think another interesting thing that when we talk about Christianity is forced conversion is not allowed. It's heretical. And people, well, but they did it during, I'm not saying people haven't tried to pull it off.
Right.
I'm saying that it's heretical.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And what you said on your website, I would say amen down to the ground. Now back to Senator Snoutworthy. He says my faith, which is a very precious and private thing, will have no impact on my behavior while I'm in Washington, D.C., representing the good people of whatever. And then 6 months into his term, let's say he's pulled over in a red convertible with a couple of hookers in the car and $10,000 worth of cocaine in the trunk and a couple of unregistered firearms.
Yeah.
And the following Monday, he has a press conference and he says, look, I promised the good people of my home state that my faith, which is a very precious and private thing to me, would have no impact on my behavior while I was in Washington, D.C., and I'm proud to say that I have kept my commitments.
I've never thought of it that way. What I tell people when people saw that quote on my website and they get on social media and they criticize me for it, and I said, well, your religion is private. I said, I'm going to tell you something right now. I said, anybody tells you that the religious beliefs do not influence them in Richmond or Washington, D.C. or wherever, I said, is lying to you about one of two things, either their religious commitments or whether or not it's influencing them. Because if they are religious commitments, then they inform the way you think about the world.
That's right.
And so there is no private in the sense that it doesn't impact the way I see things or interpret reality. It has to. Otherwise, it's meaningless, and I don't really belong to that faith.
So it makes sense to separate church and state because the state is a government and church is a government. The visible church is governed in a certain way. It has officers, it has meetings, it exists in this world. We're not talking about the invisible church. We're talking about the visible church on earth. It's a government. And civil government is also a government. And it's a bowl of apples and a bowl of oranges. And you can keep them separate because they're both bowls of fruit. But separation of morality and state is a question of whether the apples are rotten. Not whether you're combining apples and oranges, but whether the apples are rancid. So if somebody says, so you could turn it around and say, so you're saying that you want absolutely no connection between morality and government? No, who wants to live under an amoral government? Right? But as soon as you say, no, I want the government to be moral, then the question, okay, great. Which morality?